and also thank you for being adaptive to my circumstances and letting me kind of give this presentation. As was mentioned, there's a bit of a kind of background going on to my life, so the presentation might not be as polished as I want, but I think it's important nonetheless to give the presentation. So I'll begin. Michel Foucault's Madness and Civilization, A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason begins with the description of the Narrenschiff, or the ship of fools, strange drunken boat that glides along the calm rivers of the Rhineland and the Flemish canals. This idyllic description of the interned mad aboard the ship sailing down a peaceful waters as the beginning of the Renaissance period is marked in violent contrast to the depictions of transatlantic slave trade and the vessels of misery and subjugation that traverse the Middle Passage at approximately this time. It'll be the point of my presentation to unsettle Michel Foucault's description of the advent of the Great Confinement, which began the classical order through similar juxtapositions. Namely, that I will argue the ensuing debate between Michel Foucault and Derrida over the philosophical possibility and the veracity of a history of madness produces an anti-Black and colonial form of subjugation through the occlusion of the idea of race as it impacts the debate itself. By using the work of Sylvia Winter, in particular her monumental work, This Unsettling of the Coloniality of Being, Freedom, and Power, I will reorient this history of madness towards a decolonial critique of the history of reason, and thus over the debate of the historicity of philosophy itself. The question is a way of accounting for the very historicity of philosophy, as Derrida says in his response to Foucault. Thus, this crisis of reason that Derrida concludes his essay with, a complicity with madness, can be viewed as a complicity within the complicity with the anti-Blackness that provoked the colonial project of modernity. The final goal, then, of this essay will be to use Wynter's work to open up this history of reason to alternative modes and beings and knowledge that have therefore been excluded from the purview of reason and thus of philosophy itself. The stakes of this debate are quite high, as many commentators have been at explicit planes to note that the debate has come to be a sort of mini microcosm of the ways in which each respective thinker's methodologies have been received. Many commentators have in fact decided that their kind of positions and their methodologies are at once incompatible, though they share overlapping fields of thought and overlapping goals, specifically to make sure that no man, no individual is used as a means to some other end. And as a result, the stakes of the debate have often been interpreted as the stakes of critical philosophy in the French continental and the continental tradition at large. Thus, from my perspective, the explicit exclusion of philosophers of race, specifically those like Sylvia Winter, constitutes a form of racial violence wherein which alternative epistemologies and methodologies have not been included. And as a result, the conditions of reason have been highly Eurocentric as well as often anti-Black, given the conditions in which madness and reason are constructed through a potentially Eurocentric conception of logos as it derives from the ancient Greeks. With this in mind, we can begin to sort of unpack and discuss what exactly is this debate over the history of madness. And I'll begin with discussion of Foucault's project. And despite the sort of sprawling nature of his work, the debate itself rather structures itself around a sort of brief, minuscule passage in the first edition of Foucault's work on a reading of Descartes' First Meditation. And it is from this position of Foucault's reading that he tries to draw the structural analogy between Descartes' exclusion of madness as a possibility for the conditions of cogito with the larger socio-political implications of the confinement of the mad as well as various other vagrants to these, asylums or these, or within this period of what he calls the Great Confinement. And throughout the rest of his work, he begins to describe the various archaeological methods of uncovering this history of madness. And at this point, we can entertain Derrida's objection that in order to write the history of madness, that is, in order to write the history of the mad, one must necessarily use the tools of reason. That is to say, it is a philosophical impossibility to write the history of madness, given the naivety of trying to kind of discuss what we would call mad forms of discourse. That is to say that any of the ways in which we discuss the mad will always already be trapped within this sort of ironclad nature of reason. And Derrida's point historically has been received rather well, in the sense that Foucault dropped this section from subsequent editions, though Foucault himself did respond to Derrida on 2 separate occasions with My Body, This Paper, This Fire, and also a paper entitled My Reply to Derrida. And the structure and the unfolding of this specific period, of this specific piece, is interesting because, as many have noted, specifically Sylvia Winter in her later work, as well as those in the critical race areas, Foucault fails to understand and to take seriously the question of race as it pertains to various structurings of the classical order and subsequently the modern order. And it'll be my use of Sylvia Winter here in her paper, Unsettling the Coloniality of Being, to demonstrate that at the beginning of the classical order, as it came out of the Renaissance period, what occurred was not this great period of confinement as Foucault had, but rather it was a transition from theocentric conceptions of man as it came from the Judeo-Christian religion, specifically the papacy. It was a transition from the theocentric model to a political rational subject that resulted from the discovery and the attempted and successful colonization of the New World. This can be evidenced through Sylvia Winter's discussion of the document called the Requisition document, where basically Spanish explorers and colonizers introduced to the New World this sort of papal bull, or this document that basically said that if you accepted the word of God and you also bowed down to the sovereignty of the Spanish crown, we would in turn spare you any sort of violence. And the problem was that they recognized very quickly that this document was a sort of mad, drunken speech, namely that the Senu people that were the audience of this document operated with an entirely different epistemic and sociological perspective. And so any and all attempt to bring the word of God to these people was naturally going to be a sort of madness, as it were. And this is around 1500s. And so the Spanish crown attempted to then introduce a new method of legitimizing their colonial project, given the sort of failures of this enterprise with the Requisition. And from there, they came up with the idea of the rational political subject that originated with Aristotle and was put forth by the Scottish philosopher John Muir. And this, rational political subject was one who would be mapped upon the earlier divide that Wynter calls the redeemed fallen dichotomy. And for her, this is an abducting logic, which is to say that this is one of the motivating epistemic orienting and goal constructing narratives of the Western history of thought, that there are those who are redeemed and those who will not be redeemed. So with the new construction of a political rational subject, the redeemed were the ones who were ordained by God, and also later came to be kind of a secularized form that basically it became phenotype, whether or not you were white and European, and whether or not you were, brown and non-European, basically meant that you were of the fallen. So with this movement towards the racialization of reason, we can see that those who were considered to be reasonable, rational subjects were the white Europeans, and all those who were not white Europeans were irrational subjects. And this is important for a couple of reasons for the debate of madness and reason in between Foucault and Derrida. Namely, Foucault missed this earlier periodization because he was so focused on his own European concentric ideas of madness as it only ever pertained to Europe and its construction, and it's also, you know, Descartes' own project. And if we look at the earlier periodization and construction of the political rational subject in Wynter's work, we can see that what Descartes is doing with his attempts to produce the necessary and sufficient conditions for the cogito, right? The I think, the I think that cannot be susceptible to any form of deceit, whether that be a form of madness, which Foucault says that this madness must be excluded, must be confined within the philosophical document in order to construct a madness, and even this cogito that is not susceptible to a evil genius hypothesis, which Derrida calls the radicalization of the madness hypothesis. The importance then of this rational and political subject that is constructed before Descartes' project is that Descartes is not breaking or rupturing a pre-classical order with a new epistemological, you know, discourse, but rather he is emblematic of the specific fears of rationality as it originates and so as it permeates throughout the Western discourse. And so his attempts to sort of think of a political sovereign subject, a sort of philosophical sovereign subject along the lines of rationality, can be viewed as a response to the crisis of reason that is produced with the colonial order beginning in 1492. And the importance for the debate stems from the fact that what Foucault attempts to pull out from this debate is that reason required the annexation of the mad, and whether or not the mad was a sort of biological constitution, a problem of the humors, a problem of various other things. What in reality is that the problem of reason is truly actually a problem of the invention of race. And we can find this in the fact that we can find this in the fact that the construction of race, according to Chiano, is one in which reason is mapped onto the white subject, and irrationality is mapped onto the sort of non-white subject. And thus, it is not about the exclusion of madness from the purview of reason, but really it is about the exclusion of Blackness and people of color from the discussion of reason. And this is the legitimating grounds of reason itself as it carries out throughout the classical order and into the modern order and into our day today. And that is kind of the first problematization of Foucault's project in and of itself. And I would like to turn to Derrida's critique because it also does not kind of bypass these issues of the idea or the question of race. Namely, Derrida's deconstruction of Foucault's argument attempts to say that there exists a transhistorical, quasi-transcendental logos. There exists some sort of transcendental idea of reason which must exist in order to make sense of the various historical the various historical epochs of reason that Foucault is intent on talking about, right? So in the classical order, we have reason as being largely constructed through, you know, the mad as being those who need to be interned because they were sort of, almost mystical-like subjects, or that they were problems of the humors. And then in the modern order, it became a sort of biological problem. And for Derrida, Foucault misses that you cannot make sense of the history of reason without a hyperbolic moment of reason. And this hyperbolic moment of reason produces what he wants to call the fundamental decision, or the fundamental decision between reason on the one hand, logos, and non-being on the other, or madness. And that the hyperbolic moment arrives on the scene in Descartes through the evil genius, the moment at which all sensory and all phenomenological, all metaphysical sort of constructions evaporate under the sort of dogmatic skepticism that Descartes wants to talk about. And for Derrida, this reveals to us that there is a way of viewing reason, a way of viewing the project of philosophy from this perspective, from this hyperbolic moment, a moment above and beyond history that allows us to make sense of subsequent iterations of reason. Now, the problem with this is that Derrida's own insistence upon this hyperbolic moment of reason is that he fails to entertain a widening of the epistemological grounds of reason, of madness, and he fails to make a proper delineation between madness, reason, and a analytically ambiguous, but for me, central term, which is unreason. On the one hand, reason is, whatever the order wants to make it out to be. It could be a sort of way of thinking about a sort of Aristotelian teleology, Aristotelian causality. And then madness is this sort of inability to engage with and speak and produce discourse that is coherent to the order of reason. And we can find this again back in the document of the requisition, where in which for the Senu people, when they were confronted with this document, this choice, it was madness to them. It was a drunken madness speech, because for them, their epistemological and discursive logics could not make sense of such Western conceptions of monotheistic religion. And as a result of this, we can begin to see that the important part is, namely, that Derrida attempts to deconstruct the binaries of reason and madness, but misses the category of unreason, which is that which is most antithetical to reason itself. Because madness, as Foucault demonstrates, is capable of being confined and attempted to make sense of through various psychiatric, disciplinary modes of incorporation. Unreason, and this is where Sylvia Winter's work comes in, is the most antinodal to the founding category of reason in the Western history of thought. So unreason then is the reasoning, is the way in which the project, or the way in which the peoples of kind of being below the color line, the people who have been deemed unreasonable subjects, the people who are in fact, they are, not necessarily part of the reason itself. So the reason why unreason is such an important category is fundamentally misrepresented by the Western episteme, in the sense that it cannot make sense of and incorporate the discursive, poetic, aesthetic, formulations and structures. And therefore, given its misrepresentation, given its inability to be made sense of by the Western episteme, since madness could in some sense be made sense of, it for Wynter operates as a point of what she would call like chaos. It operates as a principle of unsettling this binary that madness and reason have become entwined with. And as a result, and as it's sort of unsettling of this binary, we can begin to see how Black sentience, we can begin to see how Black epistemologies, Afro-Caribbean philosophy, indigenous epistemologies, is the manner to which we can unsettle the colonial project of reason. It is the ways in which we can unsettle and deconstruct the specific discursive projects that constitute the color line, and therefore, in her words, produce this 80-20 divide, wherein 20% of the world rules the other 80%. So unreason and Black sentience are wholly missing from the debate on the history of madness between Foucault and Derrida, because of the fact that neither one of them can go beyond their Eurocentric sort of Enlightenment, Thelic as to say they're enlightened, the commitment to the European Enlightenment in some radical tradition. And because of this, unsettling through Unreason and Black Sentience, we begin to sort of rethink our self-descriptions. We can rethink ways of being and existing in the world above and beyond the ways and the sort of above and beyond the parochial and sort of provincial confines of the European history of reason, which is the history of European thought itself. And this all comes back to Derrida's attempt to say that the hyperbolic moment of reason, the hyperbolic moment is the absolute proximity to madness. It is the moment which is almost indistinguishable from madness. And I would like to say, on the other hand, that it is not the Eurocentric European construction of reason and madness, as we find in Foucault, but rather the absolute proximity to madness is in fact the Winterian conception of unreason and Black sentience that can provide us a truly path-breaking forward that is anti-colonial, anti-racist, queer, anti-imperial, as well as, a generally more inclusive self. And at the end of the day, what Wynter wants is to introduce new ways of thinking about reason, about autopoietic institutions of the self, and new ways of thinking about how it is we can possibly move beyond our limited confines, and in turn, open up new descriptions of the human beyond the overrepresentation of man. And, that is where I kind of want to leave us. And I'm going to open it up for discussion, since I know that that may have been a little bit of hectic, but I apologize given, the sort of constructions that I've had the past few days of my own goings on. But yeah, that's kind of where I want to leave it. And I'm looking forward to hearing any questions that I have.
Okay, we have just 5 minutes for discussion and question, because we need to get back to other presenters. So we can kind of get the schedule right again. So quick questions and quick answers. Brendon, I have a quick question. Do you, you didn't mention Mignolo very much, and I don't know what degree you've actually read or incorporated Mignolo here, but Mignolo makes a similar kind of argument. So in terms about racialization, that somebody like Akili Mbembe. And one of the issues that came up yesterday was the way in which post-structuralism kind of blew it when it comes to understanding decoloniality. Would you say that post-structuralism blew it? Or is that too strong a word?
That's a great question. And that's why I'm actually drawn to Wynter herself. Wynter, according to Paget Henry, is intent on using post-structuralist philosophy as a way of branching two distinctive thoughts in Afro-Caribbean thought, namely the historical perspective and the sort of ego perspective. And for her, the branch between the two is post-structural thought, with its insistence on language, discourse, as well as the sort of play of signification. So do I think that post-structuralism blew it when it came to the question of colonialism? Yes, but I think that that is something that Sylvia Winter herself is actually quite aware of, and that, a sustained reading of her work attempts to show how we can use the sort of lessons of post-structuralism to engage with this project of coloniality. And part of a larger project of mine is opening up Sylvia Winter's work beyond her engagements with Foucault, and in particular, her engagements, what I believe, with Derrida and deconstruction. So, I would say, yes, post-structuralism did blow it when it came to the question of coloniality, but I think that that is a important failure for Wynter, and that's something that she's trying to kind of engage with over the course of her work, especially as it moves beyond Marxism in the late 70s and into her more sort of idiosyncratic perceptions in the 80s and up until the present.